All right, I hope you have your study sheet. Is there anybody who still needs a study sheet from last week? Hannah, Eli, and Samuel on the front page there. Picture of Mama with her little baby holding it. All right, then we are going to begin again, and we are in 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 9 through 18. Then Hannah rose after eating and drinking in Shiloh. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat by the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She, greatly distressed, prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. She made a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me, and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and a razor shall never come on his head. Now it came about as she continued praying before the Lord that Eli was watching her mouth. As for Hannah, she was speaking in her heart. Only her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. So Eli thought she was drunk. Then Eli said to her, How long will you make yourself drunk? Put away your wine from you. But Hannah replied, No, my Lord, I'm a woman oppressed in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have poured out my soul before the Lord. Do not consider your maidservant as a worthless woman, for I have spoken until now out of my great concern and provocation. Then Eli answered and said, May the God of Israel grant your petition that you have asked of him. She said, Let your maidservant find favor in your sight. So the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. So this is Hannah's great prayer. And after that, she, in the process of that, she makes a vow. And in verse 11, we read about that. It is very much like a Nazirite vow. It does not use the word Nazirite in that verse, but it certainly draws the mind to the Nazirite vow. The razor will never come upon his head, dedicated to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor will come upon his head. If that's not a Nazirite vow, I don't know what it is. And so she makes this kind of vow that even before birth, she's going to give her son to the Lord all the days of his life. I want to observe something about Hannah's prayer in verse 13. What kind of prayer is that? In her heart, silent. I remember as a little child when we were in a certain situation that we might be instructed, just pray to yourself. Now, the parents didn't mean pray a prayer to you yourself. What they meant is pray a silent prayer. We're not going to say prayer out loud today, maybe sitting down, having something to eat, or maybe the family wasn't even all together, and mom might say, just say a prayer to yourself. And what she meant was say a silent prayer. A prayer where you're praying in your heart and your mind, maybe giving thanks for your lunch or something you're going to have to eat. Just say that silent prayer. And one thing we learn about that from Hannah, does God hear that kind of prayer? Is that an effective way to pray? Most certainly is. There are many postures of prayer. There are out loud prayers, there are public prayers, there are private prayers. They may be said aloud, they may be said within the heart. But they are all effective prayers, and God listens. God listens, and He knows what is in the heart. You might think, yes. Who wrote Samuel? Is this a trick question? So we would understand that Samuel wrote at least much of this book, but in the process of 1 Samuel, guess who dies? Samuel. So who wrote the part after that? So there are probably at least a couple of authors involved here, but Samuel would certainly have written at least part of this. And what Brian's pointing out is that by inspiration, if revealed to him through the Spirit of God, is this information, and he is recording what his mother was thinking and saying and praying before he was ever conceived. Think about the touching moment of that revelation to him. That's a good point to think about. That's very interesting, isn't it? How that must have touched him. I think that comes into play in a question I have later this morning. I think that comes into play, and that's a very good point. Thank you. Anybody else? Anything else? Yes.
Just a question. Can we can assume, but you think Eli was considered to be the high priest?
Was Eli considered to be the high priest? Yes.
Okay.
I don't know why not. Is there something you're thinking about?
Trying to clarify that in my mind. That was the temple of the time during Shiloh, and he was serving there, and he called him the priest. So.
It's interesting that in 1 Samuel you will have the verbiage of the tabernacle tent and the word temple. And both of those things, was there some kind, the temple wasn't built until after the days of David, so it wasn't the temple when the word temple is used, but was there some kind of a structure beside the tent? I don't know. I can't answer that, but I find both words used in 1 Samuel as if there's temple and tabernacle, both, but it's certainly not the temple that was built in the days of Solomon. So interesting. Okay, we're going to keep looking at this, and I wanted to observe Hannah's silent prayer. And then, what did Eli assume? Here is this stuttering, stammering woman, can't hear anything coming out of her mouth, but her lips are moving. Here she is at this, setting where God is, in this tabernacle kind of setting at Shiloh, and here she is, and her lips are moving, no sound's coming out, she's drunk. Here's the question: why would he assume that? Suppose I were here, and everybody had left, everybody was gone, and I look, and there's one person with their head bowed, and they seem to be in deep concentration, and their lips are moving, but no sound's coming out. Guess what I would suppose that was? Someone's praying. Something is bothering somebody tremendously, and they don't care that service is over and that lights are being shut out, and they are in deep thought with God, and they're praying. That's what I would assume. Why would Eli assume, here's a woman, her lips are moving, I'm not hearing any sound, and she obviously she's drunk. Why would he think that? That would be more likely in the day and time and the spiritual climate of the children of Israel. That would have been more likely. I want you to notice something. Go to 1 Samuel 2, verse 22. Eli was very old. He heard all that his sons were doing to all Israel, and how they lay with the women who served at the doorway of the tent of meeting. That's the kind of stuff that's going on in Eli's day. It would have been more likely she was one of that kind. It wasn't customary to see somebody praying with that intensity. And so he went to where the spiritual climate was. That's my supposition about that. I can't state that as a fact, but piecing together the stuff going on there, when I read that, I thought, why would he think that? And then I read the rest of this and how people were behaving, and I thought, oh, it's probably more likely. He didn't see too many like that. There weren't too many like Hannah. She was unusual. Hannah didn't want to be known as that kind of woman, and she used a word with that. I'm not one of these. What word did she use? Worthless. I'm not one of these worthless ones. That's down in verse 16. Do not consider your maidservant as a worthless woman. What would a worthless woman be? What would be another way to say that? What is it? Wicked. I'm not a worthless woman. I'm not a wicked woman. I don't have evil inclinations like that. And I'm not someone who does not respect the holy things of God. I'm not like that. Now it's interesting, as we keep reading, we're going to find out that Eli's own sons, I know it's funny to say their names, Hophni and Phinehas. I know those names sound funny to us. They were called worthless men. So what I'd like you to do is just sort of park this word worthless, and when we get up to the two sons of Eli who are called worthless, look at how they behave, look at how they act, and you have a better understanding of what the word worthless means. So we'll hang on to that for now, and we'll move forward in our study. We're still verses, 19 through 28. We are in that area. Let's read verses 19 and 20. Then they arose early in the morning and worshiped before the Lord and returned again to their house in Ramah. So who are they? Who are we talking about? Elkanah, Hannah, her rival, Peninnah, and that family, his family. That's the they here. They arose early in the morning. They worshiped before the Lord. They returned again to their house in Ramah. That's where they lived. And had relations with Hannah, his wife, and the Lord remembered her. It came about in due time, after Hannah had conceived, that she gave birth to a son, and she named him Samuel, saying, because I have asked him of the Lord. So Hannah's request for a child is granted. She gives birth to a son in due time. How long is a due time? 9 months. And then you're due. So they went back home, and then in due time she gives birth to a son, and his name is going to be Samuel. So it's interesting to me, as I read through the Scriptures, sometimes time can slip away from us. Here, in a very simple way, in due time, and all of a sudden, 9 months have gone by. If you don't keep an eye on that, it'll get away from you. All of a sudden, time passes very quickly. In one verse, you covered 9 months. And so she gives birth to this little boy, and she names him Samuel. Why does she name him Samuel? You have a clue as to the meaning of Samuel. If you look in a Bible dictionary, or maybe you have a footnote in your Bible, they may all be slightly different, but you get the idea. At the end of verse 20, she called him Samuel because I have asked him of the Lord. In some way, then, you know this. Samuel, El being a reference to God, this is honoring God. This is recognizing God. God's the source of the blessing of this little baby boy, and she's connecting the prayer to the birth, and she's honoring God by calling him Samuel, as it calls up God as the source of the blessing. So he's wearing that name. Thanksgiving and consideration of God is just as important after the prayer as it is in the need of the prayer. And she reminds us of that. That's another good lesson from Hannah. Comments, thoughts, questions? We're on to the next couple of verses here, beginning in verse 21. Then the man Elkanah went up with all his household to offer to the Lord the yearly sacrifice and pay his vow. Do this with me. Some of you aren't in the New American Standard Update. Some of you are reading a different translation. So I'm leaning on my translation that I've just read, and I've noticed that some of the words are in italics. Let me read this without the italics. Then the man Elkanah went up with all his household to offer to the Lord the yearly sacrifice and his vow. But Hannah did not go up, for she said to her husband, until the child is weaned, then I will bring him, that he may appear before the Lord and stay there forever. Elkanah, her husband, said to her, do what seems best to you. Remain until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord confirm his word. So the woman remained and nursed her son until she weaned him. I left out the italicized words in the translation I'm reading from. And it gives you a little different feel for the text. So God has worked providentially. She's named the little boy Samuel. If you compare this to chapter 1, verse 3, this man would go up from his city yearly to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. What is different about chapter 1, verse 21? What is added into that customary trip, that usual trip to worship God in Shiloh? What is it? A vow. He's going to worship God, offer the Lord the yearly sacrifice, and his vow. What is that? Do you all piece that together? That's different. That's different from the beginning of chapter 1. Now there's a vow involved here. And I want to read a couple of passages out of Numbers 30. Numbers 30. This, I think, makes sense. Numbers 30, and I'm going to begin in verse 6. This is a chapter that has laws for vows made in the Old Testament period. However, if she should marry while under her vows, or the rash statement of her lips by which she has bound herself. Are you picturing Hannah praying for a baby boy? Are you picturing Hannah promising God, I will give him to you all the days of his life, and a razor will never touch his head? Picture Hannah, okay? And she's bound herself by this vow. And, verse 7, her husband hears of it and says nothing to her on the day he hears it. Then her vows shall stand, and her obligations by which she has bound herself shall stand. But if on the day her husband hears of it, he forbids her, then he shall annul her vow which she is under, and the rash statement of her lips by which she has bound herself, and the Lord will forgive her. The law of the vows is, okay, she's married, she makes a vow, it's a rash thing, it's a harsh thing, it's a difficult thing, she binds herself by it, and now her husband hears about it. And as soon as he hears about it, he says, no, I disagree with that, we're not going to do that. She's released from that vow. But if he doesn't say anything when he hears about it, that's a binding vow, not just on her, but on him. That becomes a binding vow. He's involved in that. They're married. Then it becomes a binding vow. Now, down to verse 13. Every vow and every binding oath to humble herself, her husband may confirm it, or her husband may annul it. But if her husband indeed says nothing to her from day to day, then he confirms all her vows or all her obligations which are on her. He has confirmed them because he said nothing to her on the day he heard them. But if he indeed annuls them after he has heard them, then he shall bear her guilt. So there are laws about vows there. And if you look back in 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 21 through 23, Elkanah is going up, like usual, to worship the Lord and offer a sacrifice to the Lord and his vow. But now we have a contrasting word. Hannah said, "No, I'm not going, not yet. I'm going to wean this child before I go." And then in verse 23, he said to her, "Okay, you do what seems best, remain until you've weaned him, but you make sure that the Lord confirms His word. You make sure that vow is paid. You make sure you do what you promised." So he's going up ready to deliver Samuel to Eli. And she says, "No, not going yet. I'm going to stay here with him until he's weaned." And he says, "Okay, I understand, but don't go back on the vow. You make sure that's done." That seems to be what's going on in this particular text. So he's ready, she's not, she wants to wean him. How long is that process? Weaning the child? 3 to 9 years. I don't know where you read that.
I read it in a Bible narrative.
In a Bible narrative. Okay, that's long. I've heard 2, 3 years, up to 5 is the max I've heard. I've never got to 9, but that I don't know about that. But it's going to be a little while, isn't it, Ron?
My grandma told me that she weaned my dad, sat at the table and was still nursing her.
I don't know that I understood all that. But in other words, it was a lengthy period.
It was must have been at least, a year old, 2 years old.
Yeah, I think that would be between a year and 2 years. I think it's probably more common today, but I think back in that time it may have been a little bit longer. We have some clues. I'm not sure if some of this is guesswork, but let's just keep looking at it and see. Elkanah is agreeable to this, but he does voice a concern in verse 23. This vow must be paid. The Lord needs to confirm His word. This is something between you and Him. I didn't annul it, and we are bound by this. You be sure that this is carried out. So he wants to make sure she's not just crawfishing on the promise. Because you know how it is after you give birth to that baby and you fall in love with that little one, that's difficult. Very difficult to do. So I'm going to read this in the New Living Translation. This is 1 Samuel 1, beginning in verse 21. The next year, Elkanah and his family went on their annual trip to offer a sacrifice to the Lord and to keep his vow. But Hannah did not go. She told her husband, "Wait until the boy is weaned. Then I will take him to the tabernacle and leave him there with the Lord permanently." "Whatever you think is best," Elkanah agreed. "Stay here for now, and may the Lord help you keep your promise." So she stayed home and nursed the boy until he was weaned. Now, some of that is somewhat of a paraphrase, but it gives the gist of what I think is really going on there. We get down to verses 24 and 25. "Now when she weaned him, she took him up with her with a 3-year-old bull and 1 ephah of flour and a jug of wine, and she brought him to the house of the Lord in Shiloh, although the child was young. Then they slaughtered the bull and brought the boy to Eli." So again, notice the passing of time. You have in due time in verse 20, meaning 9 months of the pregnancy. Then verse 21, you have them the next year, the following year, going to offer the sacrifice in Shiloh. Verse 24, when she weaned him, and that might be 2, 3, 4 years, not sure exactly. What were you thinking when you looked at the words, she went with a 3-year-old bull? What were you thinking about that? Was that the age of the boy? Was this a bull that she preserved from the day of the birth until the day she took him to the Lord? I don't know. That's a lot of guesswork. I can't say that. I don't know that. It would be an expensive offering. But I don't know that it ties in with the birth of the child. It'd be going a little too far to press that. It's something that I scratched my head on and I wondered about, probably like most of you did. So the weaned child here and the offering, and they're on their way to Eli. Other comments?
I don't believe this is tied in with his yearly offering. This was something, sort of a free will or a vow offering that was separate from the other sacrifices. She was providing this in the process of sanctifying this child to give him to the temple. This was more of associated with the vow that she had.
This is what she's doing. And this is her thanks to the Lord, her sacrifice to the Lord. All of this is. That's a good notice. Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, this is what Hannah's, this is not tied to what Elkanah usually does. This is above and beyond that. This is mentioned as something Hannah did. Good point. Anything else? All right, then we are down to verses 26 through 28. She said, "O my Lord, as your soul lives, my Lord, I'm the woman." And by Lord here, your Bible should have that with a small letter L. She's talking to Eli. She's talking to the priest. She said, "O my Lord, as your soul lives, my Lord, I'm the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. For this boy I prayed, and the Lord has given me my petition, which I asked of him. So I have dedicated him to the Lord as long as he lives." He's dedicated to the Lord, and he worshiped the Lord there. So here she comes to Eli, not positive how many years later, but a few. And she shows up there and she reminds Eli, "Do you remember back when there was a woman here and her mouth was moving but no voice was coming out, and you thought she was a worthless woman?" And she said, "No, I'm not that kind of woman." And you said, "May the Lord grant you your petition." That was me. And this is what I was praying about. And this is the vow that I made. And here's the boy child. We don't have any indication before this that Eli knew what she was praying about. We don't have any indication that he knew anything about this, which is interesting to me. How easy would it have been for her, since her mouth was moving but no sound was coming out, to keep all of that to herself? Have the baby boy and not tell Elkanah, not tell Eli, not follow through on it, because she never said anything out loud. Do you keep your word when nobody hears it? And she honored God, she told her husband, she told Eli the priest, and she followed through on that and told that. So she reveals the details of all of that. Verse 28, "And he worshiped the Lord there." Does anybody have anything at the end of verse 28 other than, "And he worshiped the Lord there"? They. Who has they? Gwen, what translation? New King James. Anybody have? There's he and they. Anybody have anything any different? How many have they? There's another one or two. Other than the New King James? Matt, you have New Living? New King James. Everybody New King James with they? All right. translators will differ on how that should be translated. Some, who's doing this? Some scholars will say he, she, they. She worshiped the Lord. He, meaning, which would, Samuel's too young to initiate that kind of thing. So this would be Eli if it's a he. If it's a she, it's Hannah. If it's they, it's he and Hannah. Anybody else who might be around there. So they disagree as to how exactly that ought to be translated. But if it includes Hannah, I don't know that it does. This may be Eli going, wow, what a providential blessing of God to Eli, that God has given this boy child to him to help fill the role and share the work and carry on in the future, because Eli's old and his sons aren't faithful. And so it would certainly, you'd think it'd include Eli, but if it includes Hannah in any way, that may be a segue to chapter 2, verses 1 through 11, where she begins to offer this prayer hymn, like a song and prayer together in chapter 2. It may be a segue to that, because she is certainly worshiping God in those first 11 verses of chapter 2. Comments or thoughts before we move to that? All right, let's begin to read there, and I think we probably just need to read verses 1 through 11 and get a good handle on this. Then Hannah prayed and said, "My heart exults in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth speaks boldly against my enemies, because I rejoice in your salvation. There's no one holy like the Lord. Indeed, there's no one beside you, nor is there any rock like our God. Boast no more so very proudly. Do not let arrogance come out of your mouth, for the Lord is a God of knowledge, and with Him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are shattered, but the feeble gird on strength. Those who were full hire themselves out for bread, but those who were hungry cease to hunger. Even the barren gives birth to 7, but she who has many children languishes. The Lord kills and makes alive. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and rich. He brings low. He also exalts. He raises the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap, to make them sit with nobles and inherit a seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and He set the world on them. He keeps the feet of His godly ones, but the wicked ones are silenced in darkness. For not by might shall a man prevail. Those who contend with the Lord will be shattered. Against them He will thunder in the heavens. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth, and He will give strength to His king, and will exalt the horn of His anointed. Then Elkanah went to his home at Ramah, but the boy ministered to the Lord before Eli the priest. Hannah's prayer is what we would call an interlude. If you look at the end of chapter 1 and verse 28, she said, "So I've dedicated him to the Lord as long as he lives." He's dedicated to the Lord, and he worshiped the Lord there. And then in chapter 2, verse 11, Elkanah and his family go back to Ramah. What we read of Hannah's prayer hymn is an interlude between those two things. So chapter 1, verse 28 and chapter 2, verse 11 connect as far as where they are and when they leave and where they're going. And Hannah's prayer hymn is in between those two things. What do you notice in Hannah's prayer? What strikes out at you? Matt?
She calls out really two things back and forth. Her adversaries and God. I think the adversary must be Hannah.
All right, Matt brings up that, on one hand you have adversary and on the other one you have God. And so she's going back and forth between the sorrow she had and the attack she was under to God who has delivered, and the thing that's in the middle of that is Hannah being faithful. That's really a cool layout to think about that. What else? What else do you notice here? What is she about to do? Did I hear something about going home? She's going to give away her son, walk away, and go home. She won't see him for a year. All right, Mama's heart. Tears, sadness, crying, sorrow. Hannah is thrilled with her God. She is thankful. She is grateful. She is honoring God. She is so ready for this. And she is in thanksgiving to God. She is about to leave her little boy for a whole year. And this is her tone. The tone of her mind and her heart and her spirit. This is what comes out of her mouth. To me, what's happening at that moment makes it all the more thrilling to hear this from Hannah. What else do you notice? How much is God mentioned? If you start going down through there and counting them up, and by the way, every mention of God is in a positive way. Nothing negative about God. This is about God in a positive way. Not, if there's a God, how could He separate a mother and her child? If there's a God, how... None of that. This is all positive about God. You'll find the term Lord in small caps, which would be that Hebrew Yahweh. You'll find the term God. You'll find your, you, he, him, his, all referring to God. And you count those up, you will have at least 25 mentions of God in those 11 verses. He permeates that. You start looking at how she references God. Verse 1, He's the source of salvation. Verse 2, He's holy. The end of verse 2, He is unique as God. Right at the end of verse 2, He is a rock. Then in verses 3 and 10, He's the possessor of knowledge and judgment. Verse 6, He has the power of life and death. Verse 7, He can reverse human fortune and misfortune. Verse 8, He's creator. Verse 9, He protects and He punishes. Verse 10, He is the ultimate voice of authority. He thunders from heaven. Verse 10, again, He is a strength giver. And it could go on. There are at least 2, probably 3 references aimed at Peninnah. Find them, please. What verse seems, at least, as though it's aimed at Peninnah, her rival, who's been badgering her year after year because Hannah's barren? All right, you found something in verse 5. Even the barren gives birth to 7, but she who has many children languishes. What else did you find? Something in verse 3 there. Boast no more so very proudly. Do not let arrogance come out of your mouth. Any others? Verse 1. There you have, my mouth speaks boldly against my enemies. The only enemy we've heard of Hannah is Peninnah. That's the only one we've heard about. So there are some things in that really seem aimed in that direction. Peninnah's mouth has been silenced in her accusations. There's a number of illustrations here about God's goodness, His fairness, His judgment, His authority. There's a military illustration in verse 4. there is God's providence over the human condition in verse 5 and verses 7 and 8. It makes poor and rich, brings low, exalts, and so on and so forth. He has control over life and death in verse 6, watchful care over the godly in verse 9. He is one of authority in verse 10. There are illustrations in there. This is Hannah's song. She endured, she's faithful, and now Hannah has a song. That was our first buzzer, was it not? Second? Okay. I'm on vacation next week, but I want to begin our next session in 1 Samuel with Hannah having a song. I want you to think about that. How did she get a song? I want to tie that together, and then I want you to find your song. So we will begin with that in a couple of weeks. We are dismissed from class. Thank you.